I want to thank Melissa for organizing all of this, and also Jason Cottle for producing this beautiful poster, even though it's not such a beautiful topic. Smallpox is and was one of the most lethal diseases of a host of diseases introduced to the New World during the process of European imperialization in the 16th and 17th centuries. And that involved the encounter, conquest, colonization, and exploitation of New World lands and peoples. Ironically, as that imperial process began to fall apart in the Americas in the last decade of the 18th century, smallpox was the one disease for which a viable preventative was discovered and disseminated. And it was disseminated by the Spanish government within its global empire. The consequences of smallpox and other serious Old World diseases such as typhus, mumps, measles, plague, and influenza, among others, in the New World environment has been constantly debated in the historical literature by demographers, of which I am one, medical historians, ethnohistorians, anthropologists, and others. Those debates, however, usually focus on the extent of the demographic disaster these diseases caused, and when and what epidemics actually caused those disasters. But I will demonstrate today little doubt exists that disease played a major role in facilitating the conquest of Native Americans and the subsequent serious decline in their populations, if not also in the complete disappearance of many Native societies. Now, before we talk about the introduction of smallpox, because to make the argument I'm going to make requires knowing a little bit about the state of health of Native Americans before the Europeans arrived in 1492. Because of their isolation from the Old World for thousands of years, and because the North Asian steppes from whence they migrated, and the northwest of North America to which they migrated, mostly in small nomadic groups, served as a cold filter barrier to many diseases. Because they domesticated few animals, only dogs, some fowl, guinea pigs, and some camel-related animals, such as llama and alpaca, and because they traveled comparatively shorter distances, Native Americans suffered fewer virulent epidemic diseases. Yet, they did suffer disease. And we know this from human skeletal and mummified remains, from sculptures, wall paintings, and other artistic representations. We know this from Mesoamerican codices, such as this one, the Badianas manuscript, or also more correctly called the Codex de la Cruz y Badiano, is an explanation of the herbal use for medicines under the Aztecs. We also have information about their diseases from chronicles and oral histories. These sources provide us some information about the state of health, diseases, and medical treatments that existed among Middle and South American native peoples before the arrival of Spanish in 1492. These sources indicate that the New World was not a disease-free environment. Some of the ailments that Native Americans suffered included cleft palate, clubfoot, such as this sculpture represents, leishmaniasis, caused by a fungus that destroys facial tissue, as this sculpture represents, Chagas disease, that introduces a protozoa into the body and is still epidemic and endemic in tropical regions of Middle and South America. Other parasites, respiratory and dysenterial diseases, skin disease, blindness, dental problems. From this cactus, which is a cactus that is featured in the manuscript Medianus, was used to make a remedy for teeth pain or tooth pain. They suffered wounds and fractures, heart problems. This plant, while called suicidal, the flower was used to make a remedy for angina. They also suffered tuberculosis, pneumonia, possibly variations of influenza, and possibly syphilis, probably in its non-venereal form. They also suffered pinta, both caused by a spirochete bacteria, which also causes yaws, which was common in Europe. From several colonial drawings and paintings, we have indication of the suffering that even colonial people suffered from syphilis, including this drawing here. Also, what was learned from native peoples were several different treatments for syphilis, including a sweat box. They also used a West Indian tree called guacum, sassafras, which grows here in North Carolina, wild, and this plant called candarongo. None of these were particularly effective, however. But many of the herbal remedies that Aztecs and Inca people showed to the Spaniards were exceedingly effective. For example, cinchona, which comes from the bark of the cinchona tree, which grows wild in the Andes. It was used for fevers. And this remedy was present in all the pharmacies all over Latin America. Another plant that was used as an effective remedy was matico, this plant, which is related to the black pepper, as distinguished from the chile, or what's often erroneously called the chile pepper. This was used in South America by native peoples for skin ailments. We also know about the use of coca. It was not used in the form of cocaine, as it is today, but it was used in a tea, or the leaves were chewed for a stimulant or for altitude sickness. And since many people lived above 8,000 to 10,000 feet, it was very, very useful just in walking, moving around, or working. Also, Native American peoples effectively practiced trephination, which entailed removing a portion of the skull to relieve pressure on the brain in the case of skull fracture or other serious blows to the skull. Reportedly, they had a 50 to 60% success rate. However, in the Old World, where the same procedure was also used, only 10% of patients survived this procedure. Codices produced by Aztec informants indicate that, like Europeans, the Aztecs strove for balance to maintain health. But while Europeans strove to balance the four humors, which included blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and to avoid miasmas or bad air, Aztecs strove to maintain balance between hot and cold, wet and dry, leading to moderation in certain behaviors, such as in drinking alcoholic beverages, like their native pulque, or in sexual activity. Also, the Aztecs were observed by the Spaniards in bathing quite often, something that apparently the Spaniards did not do regularly. Although some scholars argue that smallpox arrived in the Caribbean as early as 1507, there is no contemporary evidence that exists to confirm that date. However, there is abundant eyewitness accounts from Hieronymite friars, from works by Peter Martyr, Bartolomé de las Casas, and Francisco Oviedo to indicate that an outbreak began in 1518 in the West Indian islands, including Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, and Cuba. And notice how close they are to the mainland here. Probably, smallpox arrived by ship directly from Spain. Thus, when Hernan Cortes began his adventure on the mainland in February of 1519, smallpox was already in the vicinity. His expedition was actually illegal, for originally he planned it with the Cuban governor, Diego Velázquez, who had the official permission to undertake an expedition to explore the interior of the mainland that we now call Mexico. But when Cortes got wind that Velázquez was going to cut him off, he quickly marshaled supplies, took off with their ships, and cleverly maintained control of his men, over 500 strong. Both luck and cleverness helped him to survive. Luck happened, for example, when he happened upon a formerly shipwrecked countryman, a priest who had been taken prisoner among Maya villagers and had learned Maya. And then later, and this occurred here, about here, and then later in sailing around this peninsula, which is called the Yucatec Peninsula, he encountered people from another Maya town. At first they engaged in warfare, and when it was clear the Spanish were going to win, they gave in and instead gave him a gift of 20 young women. One of these young women was originally a Nahuatl speaker. And Nahuatl was the major language of most of central Mexico and the major language of the Aztec Empire. She could also, because she had spent a good portion of her childhood as a slave among the Maya, had learned to speak Maya. So now he had, by luck, as luck would have it, a three-way translation system as he entered Nahuatl territory, and he will enter it here. His cleverness was revealed when he arrived at the place where he intended to march inland, right here along the coast. And after he landed, he had his men found the city of Veracruz, which means the true cross. He gave them control of the supplies and had them elect their own officers. Of course, they elected him as their leader. In the meantime, he had his most loyal lieutenants burn the ships. So his men became completely dependent upon him. Never fear, he also had a shipwright with him. After making his way by diplomacy and by fighting to the interior, stopping along the way at various communities, this is the Nahuatl community of Zempoala, which is just up the coast and a little bit inland from Veracruz, which is on the coast and still is one of the major ports of Mexico today. He also was able along the way to entice various groups to ally with him, especially a group called the Tlaxcalans. The Tlaxcalans had traditionally been the enemies of the Aztecs. So although a bit unsure about joining these strange foreigners at first, when they saw how effective they were at fighting, they gladly joined them and remained his allies throughout this adventure. After making his way to the inland, he reached the Central Valley of Mexico. Once near the capital, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma, the emperor, came out to meet him. Cortes was able to play on the very evident insecurities of Moctezuma. and forced him to receive him into their city. And this is Moctezuma's capital, Tenochtitlan, which was an island city-state in the center of the Valley of Mexico. And it is on the ruins of this capital that present-day Mexico City sits. Now, this is Mexico City in 1628, which doesn't look like Mexico City today. At about this time, they engaged in this big drainage project and drained most of the water so that they would have more land to build on. Now, Moctezuma was the emperor of a confederated state, not a united empire, and included not only his own people, the Mexica, from whence the word Mexico comes, but people from 2 other city-states. Not all of them trusted the Spanish, and for good reason, and they planned to attack them. And I'm shortening the story. In the ensuing fight, Moctezuma was killed, and of course both sides say that the other side killed him, and there are different accounts. But nevertheless, it caused the Spanish to flee Tenochtitlan. In the meantime, Diego Velázquez, the Cuban governor, had sent an expedition of 600-odd men against Cortes to capture him because of his illegal adventure. Well, Cortes met them, killed their leader, and of course forced all those men to join him as well. And it was among this group of men that apparently a young man who was said to have been an African slave, as a young adult, he was just getting over smallpox, probably as a result of the epidemic that was raging in the islands. Since this encounter occurred in the summer of 1520, which is during rainy season, usually in Mexico, when it's generally cool and wet in the central highlands, this served as the perfect environment for the spread of smallpox. And the disease indeed spread rapidly among a completely vulnerable population. The epidemic that raged killed and sickened many, including the young new emperor who had been elected to take Moctezuma's place, his brother Cuauhtémoc. A descendant of the Texcoco royal family, this was one of the cities that was part of the Confederation. His name, Fernando de Alva Ixtlilxochitl, wrote in the latter part of the 16th century in his own history of this event called Horrible Crueldades, or the horrible cruelties of the conquest, that Cuauhtémoc ruled no more than 40 days because he had contracted smallpox. Now, Spanish accounts do not tell us very much about this epidemic, except that it occurred, because most of the Spanish were still at the coast as smallpox fled inland much faster than people did. So most of our accounts of what happened inland come from native accounts. The most important being this one called the Florentine Codex, or the General History of the Things of New Spain. And this was a collection of information about the Aztecs, their religion, their culture, and everything about them, which was provided by native informants. It was illustrated by native artists and put together by the priest, Fray Bernardino de Sahagún. It is called the Florentine Codex because the original manuscript ended up in Florence. The part that concerns us is Book 12, which deals with the Aztec account of the conquest of Mexico. Here is a manuscript page from Book 12, and as you can see, in the original, it's in 2 columns, this column in Spanish and this column in the native Nahuatl, which the Spanish taught young men to write down using Latin script. This is an example, which the drawing you saw on the poster, of the drawings done by native artists, and this is the particular drawing that shows how smallpox affected them. And I'll read to you a little bit about what they said about smallpox. Of course, the version we actually have this book in Joyner Library. I usually keep it on reserve. I would have brought it today, but one of my students took it out to work on her research paper this week, and so I decided to just copy the page here. And you can see in this edition, which the Spanish has been translated into English, it still has the Nahuatl. And I'll read a little bit. The 29th chapter, in which it is told how there came a plague of which the natives died. Its name was smallpox, and the name that they gave it here is Totomanitsli. Later, we see it referred to often as Malat Sahuatl. Before the Spaniards had risen against us, that means before the final siege of Tenochtitlan, first there came to be prevalent a great sickness, a plague. It was in Tepilhuitl that it originated, that there spread over the people a great destruction of men. Some indeed covered with pustules. They were spread everywhere, on one's face, on one's head, on one's breast. There was indeed perishing, many indeed died of it. And then they have a long section on that they could not move, and they couldn't stretch out. And when they bestirred themselves, much did they cry out because it caused so much pain. There was much perishing, like a covering like were the pustules. Indeed, many people died of them, and many just died of hunger. There was death from hunger. There was no one to take care of another. There was no one to attend to another. And on some, each pustule was placed on them only far apart. They did not cause much suffering, neither did many die of them. And many people were harmed by them on their faces. Their faces were roughened. Of some, the eyes were injured. They were blinded. At this time, this plague prevailed indeed 60 days, 60 day signs, which is the usual time that a smallpox epidemic raged. When Cortes, toward the coast, regrouped and returned to Tenochtitlan in late 1520, he encountered fierce fighting, but from a very weakened people, with a population reduced probably between 30 and 50%. We don't know. We have no figures. The empire fell to the Spanish in August 1521, after a long siege. In addition to the epidemic that afflicted the Aztec peoples, a report in the late 1560s indicated a plague among the Yucatec Maya about 40 to 50 years previously, precisely when the first documented outbreak of smallpox occurred in the Caribbean islands, not far from the Yucatec mainland, near where the Spanish were making coastal reconnaissances. Although they could not even attempt to conquer the Yucatec Maya until the 1540s, the Spanish later did conquer them and collect information about him. In an account called the Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, Diego de Landa, a priest who wrote this account, said, about this epidemic. After that, there came again a pestilence with great pustules that rotted the body, fetid and odor. And so that members fell in pieces within 4 or 5 days. In the 1530s, smallpox likewise played a role, or perhaps played a role, in the demise of the Inca Empire in South America. During the reconnaissance of the Peruvian coast south from Panama, in the years before an expedition that would conquer the Inca, a scourge hit the empire. Descriptions by locals indicate that it could possibly have been smallpox. Whatever the scourge was, it killed the reigning Inca emperor, Huayna Capac. From the history of the Inca Empire by Father Bernabe Cobo, written in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, we have a description of this epidemic based on evidence that Cobo had collected while in Peru. And he says, "Shortly after the first arrival of the Spaniards in this land, while the Inca was in the province of Quito, smallpox broke out among his subjects, and many of them died. And later, he got smallpox." Cobo goes on to say that a healer told aides to the Inca to take him out into the sun to heal him. Now, since the Inca represented the sun, and the sun was actually, from their point of view and from their religion, the sun was the Inca's father. That was perhaps reasonable. Nevertheless, he died. His death threw the empire into a dynastic war between two half-brothers. One, Atahualpa, was named by his father as the succeeding Inca. According to another historian, Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, who himself was the son of an Inca princess, in his royal commentaries of the Inca. But that other half-brother, Huascar, who, when his father died, was still in the Inca capital, Cusco, had himself proclaimed the Inca before his father was even buried. The brothers went to war. This is when Francisco Pizarro entered the scene during the civil conflict, and he was able, like his cousin Cortes, and he was a distant cousin of Hernan Cortes, he was able to take advantage of this conflict. He captured Atahualpa, enriched himself, and conquered the empire. During the 16th century, native populations declined precipitously wherever the Spanish traveled or settled. For example, periodic epidemic crises in Mexico from 1520 to 1625 that included smallpox, measles, typhus, and other diseases, all often called matlasahuatl because they caused a rash, caused anywhere from 80 to 95% reduction in the native population in just a century. This graph begins with a population estimate of 25 million in 1519, which is the upper limit of that population estimate. But scholars have an ongoing debate about that beginning figure, estimating that it was anywhere from 5 to 6 million to 25 million. I don't quibble over these beginning numbers, for we cannot prove what they might have been, except that the population was very large. But the numbers for 1548 onward to 1625, when the population declined from over 6 million to just under 1 million here, those numbers are more accurate. And the reason being that by the middle of the 16th century, the Spanish had put in place the Spanish tribute system, which is a tax system, and they kept very good accounts of it. This was based on the previous Aztec tribute system. So, considering that those may well have been more accurate, even in the least case scenario, the population declined by 80% in just over a century. A tremendous decrease. And you can see here the periodic epidemics, and these were countrywide epidemics. At a regional level, there were others. So I've just put those that affected most areas. And they included smallpox, measles, or at least something like measles that produced a rash. And this epidemic, and some of these epidemics, as you'll see in the next graph, also affected South America at the same time. Possibly typhus, measles, and smallpox, resulting in at least 800,000 Indian deaths. Various diseases, this very serious outbreak between 1576 and 81, which also included a combination of diseases with an estimated 2 million deaths in that short period of time. And you see smallpox continuing to occur. In the 17th century in New Spain, which included Mexico and Central America and other parts, they experienced fewer countrywide epidemics, precisely because the native population had so declined and the white and mixed population was comparatively small, only a couple 100,000 by the middle of the 17th century. Smallpox needs a vulnerable population concentration of around 250,000 people to sustain an epidemic, and few areas had such population density in the last half of the 17th century. South America, which was conquered much later than most of New Spain, likewise experienced widespread epidemics in the 16th century and periodic regional epidemics in the 17th century. As you can see, some of these dates are at the same time period or just after, indicating that epidemics moved from one place to the other. Now, for South America, we don't have very good population figures, at least for the decline. We have some regional ones, but I just put an example. In 1589, during the outbreak of smallpox, measles, and mumps, in Arequipa, Peru, which is in the southern part of Peru, and which was a Spanish town with a population of both Spanish mixed and Native American, where they kept some fairly decent records. Infection rates for smallpox was 80%, with a 30% mortality, resulting in an overall mortality of 26.7%. By the 18th century, populations were increasing among all groups: natives, mixed, white, and African. For this part, I will focus on New Spain or Mexico, for that is where I have studied epidemics and the means to prevent them. In Mexico by 1790, for example, when some fairly decent censuses were taken, the population had increased to 6 million. And that included 1 million who were classified as white or of European descent, 2 million who were mixed of some sort, and 3 million who were classified as Indian. But it seems that most of the diseases introduced in the 16th century had become childhood diseases among most ethnic groups, including among most Indian groups in the 18th century. But even so, as childhood diseases, they were still deadly. And as I'll show you in a minute, for children, when they contracted smallpox, their mortality was still between 18 and 30%, so it was still very high. For example, in Mexico, smallpox epidemics occurred regularly every 18 to 20 years, and this is epidemics from Guanajuato, Mexico, where I do my research, which had a smallpox epidemic at the beginning of the century and greatly reduced the population, and then regularly every 18 to 20 years thereafter till the end of the 18th century. as you can see here. In other parts of Mexico, especially in the Central Valley, where they had a dense population, they did indeed have at least 2, if not 3, smallpox epidemics between 1706 and 1762. In the 18th century, a remedy to prevent high levels of mortality from smallpox became available. In the 1720s, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who was wife of the British ambassador to the Ottoman court, became acquainted with variolation, or inoculation, which is essentially the process of inoculating a person with live smallpox virus, often in a cut between 2 fingers or in a scratch on the arm. It was a very dangerous procedure by any measure, even then, for it induced in the inoculated person a case of smallpox, but with much lower mortality, between 1 and 3% versus the 18 to 30% among populations infected naturally. Additionally, it seems, the terrible scarring associated with the inoculation did not occur, and neither did cases of blindness and the other complications, such as erysipelas and various other secondary infections. Nevertheless, it seemed to provide a lifelong immunity. Mexico attempted to apply this procedure in the 1779 to 80 epidemic, led by a physician from Guanajuato, Mexico, although he was doing this in Mexico City. But he did not have very much success. He had no officials who would advertise the program, nor did anyone trust him. Officials were supposed to urge parents to have their children inoculated voluntarily, but like in the present epidemic of H1N1, parents feared the procedure more than the disease. In this case, they had somewhat of an argument. However, in the next epidemic, in 1797-98, the officials in Mexico were prepared. They once again attempted to urge parents to inoculate children, and this time with some degree of success. In the case of Guanajuato, the provincial intendant, Juan de Reaño, had his own small children inoculated in public in order to convince parents to bring their children forward. That was a very brave thing to do. Additionally, town councils were ordered to keep careful records of those inoculated and sick, and those who died. Physicians and their assistants visited every home and reported results frequently in the autumn of 1797 during the height of the epidemic. Indeed, inoculation reduced mortality to between 1 and 3%, although it may well have helped to spread the disease. And if you'll see here, this is the percentage of people in these various communities in the city of Guanajuato, the mining communities, in the mountains surrounding the town, and in outlying districts of the province. And overall in the province, the mortality from the inoculation was 1.1%, although it was higher in some communities. Why, we're not quite sure. Nevertheless, those that died of the disease, that got the disease naturally, as you can see, that their mortality was much, much higher. Even as Spanish imperial officials continued to fight smallpox in its American empire in 1798, Edward Jenner was developing in England a better method of prevention, the vaccine. The name derives from cow, or vaccinea, or in Spanish, vaca, since it was used to inoculate small boys that he tested this vaccine on. And of course, he got his idea from milk girls or cowgirls or milkmaids and saw that they had a kind of disease which they acquired from milking cows, and he used the pus from that to inoculate young boys, including his own young son. And then he would expose them to smallpox. This was also something very brave to do. We would never, ever allow our children to be used that way. And yet, that is how the first vaccine was developed. Now, why did this work? Well, smallpox and cowpox are both members of the orthopox virus family, and they seem to confer some cross immunity, obviously in the case of the milkmaids. We found out through studies that the immunity is not necessarily lifelong, but it was effective. The vaccine promised to be a relatively safe preventative that did not require an outbreak of smallpox to occur, as in the inoculation, nor did it cause a case of disease that was very serious. Upon publication of his method, many European governments sought to try it. But it was the Spanish government that organized the most comprehensive and effective worldwide effort, called the Balmis Expedition. It was named after its lead physician, Francisco Javier de Balmis. The expedition endeavored to take the vaccine from Spain to all parts of the far-flung empire, from the Canaries to the Caribbean to Mexico and Guatemala to South America and on to the Philippines. Balmis and his team accomplished this between 1803 and 1811. But it was not easy. The main problem was finding a way to conserve the vaccine all along the way, since they could not count on finding cows with cowpox everywhere. That was particularly true in Mexico because cows ranged widely. They didn't live in close quarters like dairy cattle did in England or perhaps in other parts of Europe, and so they didn't have this disease. They solved this problem by taking enough young boys, and they counted how many boys it would require to get across the ocean from Spain and then the Canaries and to the Caribbean, carefully measuring how long the cowpox stayed alive in each of them. They took these young boys from Spanish orphanages, hired a nurse to take care of them, and they literally carried this vaccine arm to arm, brazo a brazo, until they arrived in the Caribbean or in the mainland. There they hoped to entice parents to volunteer their children. Once again, children are used, with the Crown's promise of lifelong education and care for their children, not exactly lifelong, but until they became adults. Now that was a great enticement to poor families. And that way they were able to find enough children to take the vaccine all the way to the Philippines. Additionally, in an effort to keep the vaccine going, local communities were supposed to set up vaccination houses and vaccinate children sequentially, not all at once. If you vaccinated them all at once, the vaccine would be lost. So it required a very high level of record keeping. And luckily for us, that's what provides some of the information for our studies. And particularly in the case of places where cowpox did not exist. They found some cowpox in the Andean region because cattle on the highland mesa in between the coast and the very high Andes indeed do range in closer quarters. They also tried preserving the vaccine by drying it on string or between glass, but that mostly did not work. In fact, it was not until the 1850s that there was an effective method to preserve the vaccine, and that was in glycerin. Consequently, a major impetus for organizing public health committees and agencies in Latin America during and after the rise of independent nations from 1806 to 1830. You notice about the same time this expedition is going on, the independence movement breaks out in Latin America. But the impetus for organizing public health was initially to preserve the vaccine and to distribute it. Unfortunately, the independence wars themselves often interfered with this process. Nevertheless, there were communities after independence, despite some of the continuing chaos that independence wrought, did organize local health committees, and their primary responsibility was trying to maintain the smallpox vaccine literally arm to arm. The smallpox helped conquer an empire and adversely affected the native population. Yet, as that empire began to fall apart in the early 19th century, smallpox was the one disease that the empire was beginning to control. Indeed, after independence, at least in Mexico, when smallpox broke out, it was less lethal than before. A lower percentage of the population became infected, and mortality fell to about 12%, more than half of what it had been during most of the previous 3 centuries. Just as a coda to this, the National Institutes of Health has an internet exhibit on the history of smallpox. It is somewhat brief and superficial, but it has some entertaining cartoons published during the anti-vaccination campaign in England in the 19th century, showing people turning to cows if they got the vaccine. Those anti-vaccine campaigns mirror some of the outrageous information today on the internet and talk radio about the present H1N1 vaccine. I suppose if you get it, you will turn to swine. Thank you.
Was there anything in the material that was available to you that suggested that some of the epidemics were not as lethal and were perhaps due to variola minor rather than variola major? Certainly in Europe and the Middle East, quite a lot of the epidemics were due to the minor kind, which doesn't have a high mortality, and therefore resulted in the immunization of large populations from the major kind, so they didn't die when the epidemic went through.
That's part of the debate in the literature. The problem is, in the 16th century, scholars are not even sure what caused some of these epidemics. For some of them, we are sure they are smallpox. There were very few physicians. It's quite possible that those episodes in which typhus or measles were confused with smallpox, in which it produced a rash that was not unlike those two, that may well have been the case. But we don't have any good evidence one way or the other. In other cases where we do have mortality counts and where the mortality was about 30%, I think we can perhaps assume that it probably was the major smallpox virus that was affecting the population. But in other cases, we're not sure. There's a lot we just don't know. There were very, very few trained physicians, especially out in the countryside among Native American communities. There was a policy by the Spanish to keep all foreigners out of Native American communities. So in those communities, they would have only the one Spanish official, the corregidor, and a priest. Others could not enter the community without the corregidor's permission. And so when we had, and these officials were not trained to recognize diseases. So it's quite possible. That's all I can say.
Thank you. Very interesting. thought provoking lecture. I don't know if I have a question, but I definitely have a comment. It reminds me of a graduate student's work that I looked at a few years ago, and he'd been working on it for some time. He was a nutritionist, scientist. And his hypothesis that he was working on is that these conquests actually occurred because of the change from vegetarian to meat diet, which fits with an editorial that I wrote recently about H1N1 about looking at these infectious diseases from different paradigms, from the French of Merchant and some others who look at infection as a result of the change in the inner terrain as opposed to the invasion of perhaps both. You know, I'm wondering, do you have a comment about some of the things you looked at in terms of stats, maybe changes in diet or changes in culture or something?
That's certainly a possibility. Not only were their societies disrupted, every aspect of their society was disrupted, including the introduction of European animals, European foods, problems with diet and nutrition. We haven't done a lot of nutritional studies yet, except of the Aztec, and I was going to bring all these books, and then when I saw the rain, I thought I can't carry all that from the parking lot. There are some studies of the Aztec which try to determine the effect of diet before and after conquest. But in most of the conclusions, the Aztec diet, especially of communities far from central areas with Spanish cities, did not change a great deal. They still tended to rely primarily on corn, and since or maize, and I should say maize and not corn. And since maize was an important component of that tribute or that tax system, there was great motivation for the Spanish to preserve the cultivation of maize when and wherever they could. Now, in some places, perhaps not the introduction of meat, but the introduction of the animals did wreak havoc because they, and we see this all over the Americas, did wreak havoc with Native American crops because they would destroy them as well as the capacity, the ground, the environment over which they were planting them. And that certainly didn't help. And also, along with some of these epidemics, were indeed times of drought, famine, and we find where we've got better information on those that generally a host rather than one disease often affects a population during times of drought or famine. So that's the best answer I can give on that.
Anyone else? Well, in that case, thank you very much.
Thank you.